You're tuned in to the MtG Cable cast, where they cover Magic, the Gathering Finance. All right? You don't know about it? You're tuned in right now and get ready to learn some shit. Buckle your seatbelts and light a blunt and get ready for the MtG Cable cast. Starring Reptar and Thirsty, them onion head motherfuckers.
Alrighty, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal Cast. And this week, in our latest efforts to keep ourselves held accountable, we're taking a look back.
Yes.
So we've previously done our 3 best picks. Now we're doing our 3 worst. In our opinion, what makes them bad? What lessons, if any, did we learn from it? And how did we apply that? So with that, let's take it away.
Right. So I started basically not from the beginning of time for the podcast. I gave us a little while, and I started looking through picks, and I thought, what better way to start off talking about picks centered around Commander than by one of the biggest, dumbest Commander cards I've picked, and that is Tooth and Nail, specifically from Modern Masters. I picked this in episode 22 in March of 2019, and the market price was $17 at the time. Modern Masters Tooth and Nail is currently a $3 card. Now, what made this a bad pick was something that we didn't know was going to happen, and that is that some of these beloved game-ending spells, these spells that don't really catch a lot of ire from the community, are ripe for reprint. And it might seem on the surface now like, yeah, they're just going to reprint everything into the ground, or, oh, this looks great in Commander, they're going to make a million variants, and then that's going to put downward pressure on the price for all of them. Yeah, that's the lesson we learned now. Back then, and maybe into the future, when we look at specs and we see, well, okay, this card is beloved in Commander, it's not on the reserve list. Is this really worth the time for a long pick? Like I thought Tooth and Nail was going to be, not a quick flip, which you could have made out on. So overall, that's kind of the lesson here. And the more I went through picks, the more I kind of saw that trend as I was going through. So it actually made it kind of difficult for me to find picks because they all fell into this category and another one I'll be talking about pretty shortly thereafter. So I had to pick these like signpost guides for like, hey, not only was there a really big price drop here, but the theory that I put behind this card and why I backed this card was wrong then and needs to be updated.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things here is that there's, and I'm guessing this is going to be the lesson for a lot of our cards, is be mindful of the forces outside of your control that are exerted on this game.
Yep.
Just because something looks really good doesn't mean it necessarily is.
Yep.
Which I also went back almost to the beginning of time from our 7th episode. And this was in December of 2018. What a different world it was when Liliana of the Last Hope was $45. I picked this card because we were going into a Modern Pro Tour season, because it had a pedigree and because it had just come off an all-time low. Since then, it has been reprinted only twice, but one of those was in Double Masters.
Yes.
Now you can get the Mythic edition of this card for half of what you could get the Eldritch Moon one for. The other thing that this didn't necessarily keep up with is power creep. I'm not sure Liliana of the Last Hope is even a top 10 walker at this point anymore. And that's the lesson I learned, is that, look, you need to know when your exit is. Yep. Because if I'd exited about 4 months after this, it would have been profitable. That would have been the time. But there is no such thing anymore in this game as cards that will not get power crept. There will be a day where Oko will not be good enough. I'll eat my hat on that. That is a hill I will die on. Liliana of the Last Hope is not fast enough for Modern.
Nope.
It's not a metagame that supports it anymore. It's not good enough for Pioneer. It's a card that had a pedigree, and that was why I picked it. But you need to understand that pedigrees evolve, the game evolves, and we get more and more pushed.
Nope, I agree with everything you said, and that extends now into what we're seeing with the spoilers for Modern Horizons 3. We're seeing a format that doesn't look to be slowing down. We're going to get a BNR shortly after MH3, and I really doubt that WotC is going to be doing anything in an attempt to slow that format down. So a 3-mana walker, just that is that does really nothing but shrink the toughness of a creature isn't going to do a whole lot when that doesn't kill creatures anymore.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing is when you follow a player like Reed Duke, and Reed Duke moves away from this Liliana back to Liliana of the Veil, then you know that this card has probably lost its footing overall from a competitive standpoint, and there's really no hope it comes back, unless for whatever reason it shows up in Standard again and kind of takes off there. And while the emblem is overwhelming, it does take a long time to get there, and it does... The rest of the Walker isn't really thematic to zombies in Commander, so it's difficult to even try and work that card into Commander. And I'm going to use that to just steamroll into my second look back, which is Nihiri's Storm of Stone.
Oh, God.
And this is a card that basically, you know, I thought was going to make it on its passive. First Strike is big for creatures on your turn, and the activated... So the equip ability, which is the activated ability of equipment costing 1 colorless less, I thought was going to mean a lot more to the Commander format. And much like, you know, Tooth and Nail, that's kind of proven to not be the case over time. Tooth and Nail still has a home. Nihiri Storm of Stone either never had a home to begin with or just fell out of favor entirely. This card didn't really start as an outmodded card, but it quickly became clear that the passive really wasn't worth the hassle of a Planeswalker with a really bad minus ability. And when you look at the card overall, it truly has no impactful abilities at all. So this is just an example of kind of a really bad card valuation in regards to the way the Commander format worked. I thought the passive was enough to just pump this up from being, you know, a penny spec. Then this was $3.53 for the foil, which is what we were looking at. I think now the foil is like maybe $1 if you're lucky. And at the end of the day, the second trend on this card that I saw is that unless the card has a player pedigree and is currently popping, like Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, then the ability for me to evaluate a Planeswalker properly in Commander is very difficult. Tyvar was different because it comboed in Pioneer. It worked out really well for a little while, and then what happened, the format rotated a little bit, and the Rona decks basically fell out of favor. People are still dedicated to them, but not like there were before. They're not as resilient, and unless something changes within that format, I don't expect Tyvar Jubilant Brawler to really make an impact as a spec. And without that kind of pedigree, basically I've learned that there's no reason I should be looking at Planeswalkers for as an evaluator for Commander unless it's literally one that makes elves. That's probably a fine Commander, or maybe a Sarkon here and there because it poops a dragon. Like the two of the most relevant tribes. We don't get a lot of Planeswalkers that fart angels, but if it ever happens, like, hey, we'll be there as a spec for sure. But aside from that, things like Nihiri, I've learned to stay away from.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing here, and you touched on, is, you know, the Planeswalkers, like Tyvar Kell makes elves produce black and is $2. Well, that's the most relevant elf tribe, or that's the most relevant tribe, and that's a relevant effect, and it's still only $2.
Yeah, there's another Planeswalker that literally makes Llanowar elves. I think that's what it says.
Yeah,
and like
it's one of the free releases, I think. Yeah.
Same thing. That card should be worth almost nothing, despite like literally making a Llanowar elf.
Yeah, and that's, you know, and this was because I was really high on this card as well when it first got spoiled and came out. I was like, oh, this looks absolutely amazing because, like, dude, equip in Boros. This should be insanely relevant to the like philosophy of the color combination in Commander, and it just didn't work out because, you know, it's not good enough because there's other ways to do that thing that are better. Pure Steel Paladin, sure, it doesn't get first strike, but it lets you equip for 0, which is pretty good.
Even Brass Squire, which just moves equipment around for a tap, same thing. It's free, it's cheap, it's easy to engage with because it's purely colorless. Sure, go ahead. It's impactful. But...
And I think the passive was where it was at, and it just wasn't good enough in that one. Speaking of not good enough, I am going to admit something on air that I said I would never do. And that is admit that I think I've picked it 4 times now. Sarkhan's Unsealing was a bad pick. I believed in this card because it's an enchantment that does it's a red enchantment with too much text that does dumb things with big creatures.
Yep.
Which, similarly to Nahiri, should be good enough. Dumb red enchantments with too much text actually do take off. Stranglehold, Vicious Shadows, there's a pedigree here for these things to exist. This only got one reprint, and it's still less than 50 cents.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not good enough, because as much as you can believe in a card, as much as a card makes sense, you still have to have buy-in. And without buy-in from the people that are playing the formats where this card would be relevant, i.e. EDH, the card is never going to take off. This is not something that needs a content creator bump. That's not going to help it. This is not something that needs to have, that's a commander away from being relevant. That's not going to help it. It's just not good enough. So the lesson here was examine your core spec beliefs periodically, such as red enchantments with too much text are a good buy. Because as much as I love this card, and I still love it because it's a red enchantment with too much text, that's just not good enough.
Yeah.
Vicious Shadows is an incredibly good enchantment, and it does not have a real price point. So if that doesn't do it, why would Sarkhan's Unsealing do it?
Yeah.
And it's just not there.
There's what is it? People are looking at the enchantment that just got spoiled today. Kozilek's Unsealing.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like Sarkhan's Unsealing in blue. I mean, imagine that, Kozilek's Unsealing, Sarkhan's Unsealing.
Yeah.
And I'll bring it up here. It's 2 and a blue for an enchantment, devoid, because all the Eldrazi stuff in Modern Horizons 3 is whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4, 5, or 6, create 2/0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sack this creature, add a wingding. That's basically the exact same thing we see on Sarkhan's Unsealing. It's got a 4, 5, and 6 trigger, except it deals 4 damage. And then whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, you draw 3 cards, as opposed to the red trigger, which is whenever you cast a creature spell with power 7 or greater, Sarkhan's Unsealing deals 4 damage to each opponent and each creature and each planeswalker they control. So Sarkhan's Unsealing costs 1 mana more than a blue enchantment. It is rare. And it just sprays damage around the table, which we thought was going to be great at the time, as opposed to now this blue enchantment, which basically just makes little turds, and which allows you to just fire up more spells and draw a bunch of cards when you play affinity creatures, like Mirror Enforcer and the Sojourner, the frog.
Yeah.
The other Mirror Enforcer, right? Thought Monitor, etc. And that ability to draw cards is, as we're seeing, worth more than the ability to just spray 4 damage around unless you're Omnath. Yep. And this card has been immediately outmodded by an uncommon that costs a colorless less. So we're looking at a card now that WotC is also pretty much saying, like, hey, here's a cool reference to an old card. It does a lot more for a lot less. So you should probably stop playing that old card. We might get something better in time. And that is something we're going to have to build into our heuristics and our models. Like Sunbird's Invocation was fantastic. Everybody jumped on the card. It was a great spec. And the first time it got reprinted, everybody that wanted one bought one. And now after that, it's basically just been outmodded because we have so many new ways to cascade.
Yep.
We don't need Sunbird's Invocation anymore. It's kind of ridiculous. But I do like the idea of red enchantments that have too much text. We just got to find the right ones. I think there's a mana threshold we might have to attach when we build these new heuristics. Maybe 4 is too much. Maybe this card needs to do 6 damage instead of 4. Not sure. We'll figure that out in time. For me, the last card, and if you're watching this, you saw me spoil it as I was clicking around, is Aldrich Evolution. And basically, I picked this in 2022, late 2022, on the back of what was essentially like a Birthing Pod combo alternative option hype. And this is the first time, I believe, on the podcast, and the last time, that I made a pick into that kind of deck for Modern. And the lesson here is that it's very difficult to make picks into that deck in any format. Subsequently, the deck has basically evolved into the Selesnya or Mono White Vizier combo deck. It could be with Devoted Druid or not. You're basically just going infinite with Heliod and Walking Ballista. You're no longer going through this chain. And between that pick and here, we also saw Scrib Ranger used in a goofy version of the deck. I think Breaching Hippocamp in a different version of the deck. And like these were all picks that I've made but not brought to the podcast. I have them sitting in my 1K. I think still there's a little utility on script sprites because it's kind of like is a Quirion Ranger where you can untap a creature.
Quirion, yep.
Right. Or Quirion Dry, whatever it is. I think it's Ranger. And so that has probably a longer lifespan on it as a pick, something that can be moved a little more reliably because it is something pretty unique in constructed formats and allows you to like further a game plan. Eldritch Evolution is like very tight. It doesn't do quite what Yawgmoth does now when it chains through. It's not that it's been outmodded. It's just no longer the best option in the slot. Collected Company is still just a better look overall, no pun intended. And we kind of started behind the 8-ball because I expected people to want to be as surgical with their searching as they were with the Birthing Pod deck. But in reality, the context of that deck shifted and it started to do a little bit more across the board, utilizing cards that let the players see a larger range of options and present a better and stronger game plan because of that. We weren't just trying to play Thought Seizes and then combo you out anymore. We were just trying to play this value creature game where our threats were really sticky or they were difficult to deal with, and then eventually we could either win the game by beating down like we would in Birthing Pod or comboing you out. And then eventually, like I said, it changed to the Heliod combo deck where we had a bunch of the spikes, which are very difficult to deal with. We got Recruiter of the Guard and the, I can't remember the name of the other card in white. That is Silence when you sack it.
Ranger Captain.
Ranger Captain of Eos. Like we got that, which play into just a Selesny version of the deck or mono white. And so the green side just... The search side that isn't Court of Calling or Collected Company just kind of fell away. Those cards are easier to play. They're instants, not sorceries. There's a lot more to like about them in that deck compared to Eldritch Evolution, which is a very surgical option. Something you're going for specifically when sacrificing a creature, where Collected Company and Court of Calling don't ask you to do that. Also, it doesn't allow you to do the thing that Court of Calling does with Wall of Roots, which is that in paper, can you actually put the last pip on the wall to effectively kill it while convoking Court of Calling? Is that a thing you can do? And you ask a judge, and when they hem and haw, then you ask them to escalate just so you can see the judges fight.
Yeah, that's
it. You don't get that with Eldritch Evolution.
No, you do not.
You get Judge Fisticuffs with Court of Calling.
I've always loved Eldritch Evolution.
Yeah,
I think this is a card that, it needs to live in the EDH, and I think that's okay for it.
Yeah.
I think that it, because you and I both, when you were discussing this pick, I was like, yeah, no, this is great because it's just another version of Pod.
Yes.
That lets you do Pod things. Mm-hmm. Well, sorry, Pod is too slow now. Yeah. So Splinter Twin, free the political prisoner. Anyways. So I think this is something that is still a fine spec and it's still a fine pickup. I just think it's not where we thought it was.
Yeah.
Because you're right. We thought it was going to be Modern Pioneer all over the place, and it's just not.
Yeah.
Because we got Power Corrupt.
Yeah, you can probably pick these up for nothing from binders and trade them out to people at something. Like either on the same, like pick them up as throw-ins and then move them around because this is now a $4 card down from $7. This could finish up a trade, and then you could probably move it for a little bit. Like it's not too difficult. Like you said, people do play this in Commander. It is a viable option in that format. Your last pick.
My last one. Oh boy, howdy! For some reason, I thought it would be a good idea to pick Isolated Chapel out of Dominaria. I don't know what my reasoning was. It was $376 at the time, but I can tell you one thing. The lesson that I've learned here is, holy shit, do not ever spec on lands because they will be reprinted into the ground and power crept within 6 months. So unless it's on the reserve list, don't be involved with it.
Yeah.
We have so many better ways to add white and black mana now that comes into play tapped conditionally. Or even that doesn't. The Surveil lands are just better than these.
They're fantastic.
There's no reason that cards like Isolated Chapel should have ever been something that I picked. It's just an objectively bad card. It's an evergreen, non-plane specific. And piggybacking on that, I once picked Blackleaf Cliff saying it's plane specific. We'll never go back. And then they reprinted it.
Because we went back, to be fair.
That's fair. We did go back. Nevertheless, they reprinted it.
Yeah.
So the lesson I took away from this, because this was just the one that I picked that exemplified this.
Yeah.
Not a single land outside of Soldevi excavations that I picked, and I think Kjeldren Trade Outpost, appreciated in price. Everything went down because it's been reprinted, because it's been power crept, because it's rotated out of favor, because frankly, these lands, these check lands, aren't even in the EDH auto include list anymore for 2-color decks, because we've gotten so many 2-color lands that they've been outpaced that it just doesn't matter, because you don't necessarily have the basic count for them.
I think people are still clamoring to finish the cycling land cycle from Battle for Zendikar, which means getting the enemy ones, which means because they have basic land types and cycle, they will outmod Isolated Chapel and Friends.
Yep. Exactly. Like, and we're waiting on the Horizon cycle. Granted, that's the ally ones, but still. There's so many things that Wizards has done from a design perspective, and that players have done from just a theory crafting perspective, that have moved away from this. And again, the lesson there is, if it is something that is core to the game, that you have got to have to play the game, such as a land, it's going to get outmoded quickly. Don't bother holding it.
Yep.
At this point, I think Shelldock Isle may have appreciated from release price, but even that is prone to a reprint at any time. It's just not, in my opinion, a good habit to get in as speculators, is to speculate on any kind of mana.
Yep, I think that's a fine look overall, is that if you're going to look at speculating on lands, basically the time to pick them up is at shortly after set release, when everything's the cheapest, and the time to move them is most likely, again, the old heuristics of right before they rotate out of standard, a couple of months before they rotate out, because generally speaking, things just don't get reprinted. Rare lands don't get reprinted in standard. I'm sure there's a time where we might have had reprints back to back. I know there was never
lands, technically.
No, I was thinking of 8th edition to 9th edition, the Pain lands. They were in both the allied Pain lands. They never overlapped. I don't think the core sets overlapped. I don't remember how that rotation worked. I don't remember when core sets came out. So there might have been that opportunity where they literally got reprinted into standard, 7th, 8th, and the 9th. Yeah, they were in all three of those. Yeah. So if they overlapped, that might have been realistically the only time that happened, the allied Pain lands. But we don't get any of these cool specialty lands anymore, like reprinted like this into standard. So yeah, like you said, if you really need them or you really want to spec on them, then the time is basically shortened. There's no more infinite timeline on this. I think setting aside reserve list lands, I think the only lands you can pick on and sit on for an infinite timeline are the Onslaught fetch lands. And I don't mean the reprints. I mean literally the
Onslaught versions
from fetch lands. Because no matter what happens, every time those fetch lands get reprinted, it becomes a little easier to buy into the Onslaught fetch lands compared to what their price was like 3 months before reprint. And then eventually they all go way the hell back up. Like I'm pretty sure Flooded Strands is a $70 to $80 card right now, which I think is the most expensive it's ever been. And if I had to take a guess, Polluted Delta is probably over $100. And for me, that is a price tag that is justifiable for that card because Onslaught happened so long ago that this stuff's just not coming back. I really want to take a look at this.
Flooded Strand is down because of the reprint in MH3.
Which is, like I said, the reprint happens and things are easier to pick up. The market on Delta right now is about $80. It crested
76 for Strand. So
it crested to 100 around a release of MH2 and has been on a slow descent, which is fine. But I think those are the only other lands that you could do that with. The Zendikar fetch lands do never recover like that. The Zendikar fetch lands, like those Zendikar fetch lands, are ridiculously cheap in comparison, and there's no saving them because it's the same art each time, same art. You can't do anything about it. So I think that's that, and like obviously the foils for any of this stuff, like I say any of it, but any fetch land foil, any shock land foil, that kind of stuff's fine.
Yeah, there's like some niche applications where it's okay to spec on them, but generally I just think it's bad practice.
I would at this point in time 100% agree. I don't think there's any reason to just move in on infinity lands to expect to ride them into the sunset.
Yeah.
Right. I'm good to go into picks if you are.
Let's do it.
All right. I went first last week, I believe, right? Because I had a diatribe. You can go ahead this week.
I will go first. All right. So I am picking something from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Bristly Bill Spine Sower. 2 mana for a 2/2. He's a bear. Landfall. +1/+1 counter on target creature. Can be any creature, not just yours. And then the real important line is the second line there. Green, 3, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Now, reading the card explains the card. This card does dumb things with counters at an affordable cost in green, which is where you want to go with it.
Yep.
Now, the most important thing is that this works with all of the other doublers in green.
Mm-hmm.
Evolution, season, all that stuff. This is a card that I expect within a year will have a massive deck share on EDH Rec for green, because this does something that a lot of casual green players love to do, and that's make counters.
Yep.
Make a bunch of dudes, make dudes bigger. It's also a theme that comes up anytime we get some kind of Simic shenanigans going on, a la Ravnica block.
Yep.
So I think this is something that we have the potential for getting in now. While it is still a little bit more expensive, it is about $15 right now. I'm still comfortable getting legitimately about 10 copies. I have 3 so far. I'm going to be working on getting the rest up. Obviously, you know, going to EDH Rec right now, you're going to see a lot of the usual suspects. What are the cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction that are going to be run with it? What are stuff like that? But Hardened Scales, Branching Evolution, Avenger of Zendikar, Inspiring Call. There's a ton of synergies that this card has with so many cards that are already out there, and an extant theme that sees play all over the place. Because I guarantee you, if you go to your LGS on any given EDH night, someone is running Dice Factory there. Someone has their cards laid out with 1,000,000 6-sided die over all of them so they can count all of the counters that are on them. That's what this slides into. It's the kind of thing that is, I think, probably going to fly under the radar for a little bit. It'll be popular in EDH, but it'll still kind of just sit in shelves because Standard doesn't want it. Modern doesn't want it. No other formats want it. No 60-card formats want this card. This is just an EDH card. Now, we've talked in the past how our timeline for investing in EDH cards is kind of shortened. Mm-hmm. It used to be about 2 to 3 months after release was when you would start to see them pick up, and it's started to pick up sooner, to the point now that we don't really see a drop-off in the card. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, as with most collector booster releases, this does have an alternate art. This does come in foil, and the foil delta is almost non-existent. And this is something I've started doing myself recently, is I've just started going for the lowest common denominator, most basic version of a card, because I'm tired of trying to pick out the one that's popular. So I do also want to specifically highlight just the non-foil pack version of this card is what we want to be going after. There's 175 listings on TCG right now, and we're going through literally about 30 to 40 a day. Now, I don't expect us to run out because I'm sure more is going to get listed in the meantime. That goes without saying. But if we don't, we're like 4 or 5 days from recording, and this is going to be done.
Yeah.
I don't anticipate that being the case, but that is something that I expect to dry up very quickly. And if you want to get it to hold on to it, now is the time to do it, so that we can make sure we have a stock that is worth outing at a later point.
Yep. I think this is a good look overall. And I just want to swerve off real quick. I'm going to bring up EDH Rec so everybody can see this. So looking at the top commanders for this card, setting aside what's in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, there's not a whole lot. There's 12 here, and there's some you would expect. Atraxa, Praetor's Voice, because that falls into the Dice Factory thing. Omnoth, Locus of Creation, because that's a landfall deck. Even Skullbriar and Vorinclex, because you're just throwing tokens around. But the big thing of note here is that there are no Simic landfall generals or base Simic landfall decks here. Like at least with a commander that screams landfall. So I think once that happens, once landfall players realize like, hey, this actually synergizes well with what we're trying to do. We're just making infinite power basically with this triggered ability. Then it really starts to pick up. So like you said, I think it's flying under the radar, and I think that's exemplified by the fact this really has not spread to the general or the commanders you would expect it to represent more the Dice Factory aspect of Commander. Overall, I like the card. I thought it was really good when it was printed. It's miserable and sealed in the fact it's just a 2/2 for 2.
It's so bad.
So it just dies to an uncommon removal spell. Like,
yeah,
very bad there. But overall, as a commander, I think it's lacking because you have Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider. But as a card in the 99, I think it fits a lot of really nice roles, which you touched on. I don't need to tread through that again. I think this is a good look overall at the opportunity to pick them up Arises, either off TCG Player or on trade. I don't think you can really go wrong. I really don't think the reprint equity on a lot of this Cactus stuff is there unless they start trying to really wedge Cactuar art on top of this in the Final Fantasy stuff. I can't imagine that we're going to get these cards again, even if we return to Outlaws of Thunder Junction. We'll probably get the next Bristly Bill. You know, after he's tended his fields.
What's the next evolution?
Yeah, what does he do? You know, that's probably what we'll get. I don't think we're going to get this again. It's a named card tied to Thunder Junction. Basically, I can't imagine this really getting printed in a Commander product because of that. It seems a little weird because it's not agnostic. It's very, you know, tight to the plane. So I think we're also kind of safe there. But to, again, dovetail off that with a Handbrake 180 of things that might not be safe, my pick for this week is Forsaken Monument. And this is basically, I've been terming it like a Super Lord and Mana Flare in my notes. This is a 5 mana legendary artifact. It says colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever you tap a permanent for colorless mana, add an additional colorless mana. So right there we have the Super Lord and the Mana Flare. And then there's this neat little trigger. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. Neat card overall. When I was taking my notes, Card Kingdom was buying 26 at $3.50. They had a retail of $7, and they were just displaying their 8 copies. They are currently buying 30 copies. We're up at $3.50. Not that great. You would expect if they're looking to buy more, then they would up the sale price. But we'll get to why that might not be the case and why this is like, it's not a safe pick for the next couple of weeks, but I think we're going to be pretty good here. On TCG Player, when I was taking my notes, there are 240 listings at $4, a market price of $4.64, and we're basically in that same range. We lost about 10% of the listings, sorry, 1% of the listings, and we also saw like a 1% increase in market price, so like within the scientific margin for error there. When I added this to my list to watch, March 11th of 2024, CK was buying 20 at $2.70, so less for less. They had none in stock, however, and the retail was only $5.50. So the retail has gone up on this since I've added this to my notes in the last 2 months. There were 222 listings of LP or better on TCG Player with a market price of $4.73, which is about like 5% under current market price. So we're seeing a dip there. Now, when we look at this card, like what are we doing with it in Commander? And basically in Commander, this goes in decks centering around artifacts and/or colorless creatures. And I want to put some emphasis on artifacts because it seems like some people might be missing that. You know, whenever you cast a colorless spell, well, an artifact is a colorless spell. A devoid creature is a colorless spell. You get 2 life. Cool. Colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. That those creatures can be artifacts, they can be devoid, they can be purely colorless. I think some people are kind of missing how wide colorless is as a descriptor, but I'm not going to harp on that too hard. Overall in the format, like I said, this is basically, I term it, a Super Lord and a Mana Flare for colorless sources stapled together for about 2 mana less than its component pieces before you even get to the life gain trigger. This +2/+2 we usually see on creatures that cost upwards of 6 mana. I think maybe, I can't remember the last time I saw it outside of like Megantic Sliver, I think.
I think Megantic's the last one.
Yeah, and that cost $1 million, and then Mana Flare just costs 2 and a red. So right here we have savings on an artifact, and you know it's not the sturdiest card type in Commander, but hey, you know you got any port in a storm.
Yeah,
this card goes infinite with almost every single monolith in the game that has an untap ability. So that gives you both infinite colorless mana and infinite untaps. And now this can kind of lead to any myriad of effects, from something as goofy as like a lethal Comet Storm, where you just make 1 million colorless mana to dump into an X spell, or a Thassa's Oracle kill because you use Mesmeric Orb to just mill your deck out. Yep. So immediately you can kind of have this like quote unquote competitiveness to it before you even look at like what it does for creatures. The Lord effect, though, like as far as that's concerned, that's actually what I thought the draw to this card would be overall. And that's basically where I see it according to Rec when you take a look and you see what people are doing with it. They're playing it for the lore portion. So great, they're already engaging with this. We do see it in both artifact-centric decks as well as Eldrazi and Devoid decks. And we're seeing people do things like there's a green-black color pairing a partner commander, I believe. The green half makes a colorless golem, so people are playing it in that deck. Cool, because they're probably just making a bunch of colorless things. Awesome. Now, I would just expect that these more casual styles of decks would play to a stronger board presence by taking advantage of the Mana Flare and the pump effect to kind of end the game with overcosted creatures, but it really seems like people aren't engaging with it like that. Like the self-selecting crowd that is EDHREC is basically telling us that there's a whole like almost 60,000 people that are playing this out of a possible 4 million. But people are playing this kind of where we expect it, and like when we take a look at Rec. So I don't really know what is wrong here with the adoption overall. I think this really offers everything that a player wants when they want to enter combat with colorless creatures. It might just be overlooked. And now we can start talking about why this is a little dicey. As far as the timeline is concerned, if we don't see this reprinted in the Eldrazi Commander deck that we're getting with MH3, a deck that we should have the list for in the next few weeks, that's going to be our resell time. If it is reprinted in that deck, however, we're probably looking at somewhere closer to a year. The supply of Forsaken Monuments from Commander Masters saturated the market, and the precon that came with Commander Masters that was Eldrazi didn't really do much to push interest in building colorless decks with this card, despite it being inside the precon. So people didn't want to buy into singles from that deck, like Forgotten Monument, to rebuild the deck at home or put them in another deck. They just kind of accepted what was in the marketplace. They didn't really do us any service. They didn't really want to pick this up. So I'm hoping that if we don't get it in the Commander deck, then that's going to make people look and see this card, and that's when we'll get the push. But if we do get it in the Commander deck, this is the second Eldrazi Commander deck in a year almost, and an entire set that right now seems to be wrapped around Eldrazi and the Devoid mechanic. Yeah. So even if we do get it in that Commander set, I think we might be fine because there's enough grist for the mill where people are going to want to just build their own decks. They won't want to use the precon, and they've got to go out and get this card. Cool. And I've just been looking at the Zendikar Rising numbers this entire time. That's the one I would expect to be able to move the easiest because I believe right now it is technically the cheapest. Reprint equity, well, this was reprinted exactly where we would expect it to be, in a colorless-centric Commander deck. Its first reprint was in the Commander Masters Eldrazi deck in August of 2023, so 9 months ago. And I expect we might see it again in the Modern Horizons Eldrazi deck, but I still want to look at this card in the face of that deck. I would wait on buying these up until the week before we get the lists, and then just pulling the trigger then and saying F it, because for whatever reason people are not moving on this card at all, because either people don't really know about it or they don't want to engage with it because of what they might think is an inevitable reprint. But I think it's a fine look to buy in now. Quantity overall, I think I've got about a play set of these from opening Zendikar Rising, and I might even have one because I played Kozilek the Great Distortion for a while. That was a commander that I jammed. I thought it was a fine card then. I think it's a fine card now. And I think this is a good card that even if we do get a reprint, will rebound. And if you want to wait until we see whether or not we get a reprint, there really will be no bad time to buy this card. It's just going to be how long you have to sit on it before you can churn it.
Yeah, I love Tribal Lords. I love Tribal Effects. I think this is one of the best all-in-one spells in a very long time. It's a card that, when it came out, I thought there may actually be a home in a 60-card format for it. Not the case. I don't think that will ever be the case. But I think, much like you, even if we do get this reprinted now, it's still a fine time to buy in. And I'm honestly not sure that it will get reprinted, actually. They may just try to jam in new cards in the Modern Horizons Commander decks. We don't know.
Yeah.
But like you said, there's never a bad time for it. And this is something that, looking at the adoption, I'm also a little surprised at how low it is, which again, it's a self-selecting group, so not the most relevant information. But this card does everything you want in an Eldrazi, in a colorless, in an artifact deck.
Yeah.
Everything you want. There's no reason to not run this card. The life gain is just like cherry on top. It's incidental, whatever, but it also helps with Aetherflux Reservoir if you're doing that.
I was thinking about that actually when I was looking at this. I was like, can you gain enough life to just start like firing your beam at people? Like,
yeah. I think there is a world where that's true, and
yeah.
I think that this card is. It's not quite plane specific. It's not a story highlight card,
No.
but I feel like you said, the only place we will ever see this card reprinted in the history of ever is an Eldrazi Commander product.
Yeah.
So if we do dodge a reprint, this card could see a very serious gain.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say about this pick is when you take a look at the numbers on rec for the people that submitted that they basically are playing the Eldrazi Precon, Zolodok Void Gorger. Forsaken Monument is in 97.31% of the decks. And in Amarthus, Ghostfire, Initiate, it is in 88.55% of the decks. That means people actively removed this card from their precons.
That's insane.
And I don't think that is correct at all. I think
no.
it stays in those precons. And like, props to the people that are playing like Karn Legacy Reforged and Surge Ginger that are jamming this card, because they're the ones that like I think are doing the due diligence on this. They're the ones that are pushing this up. I don't expect that to be the case after MH3. I think for whatever reason, WotC is just gassing Eldrazi. I guess they want to see that, that type show up in Commander more often. And this is the card that kind of can be pivotal to that deck, not to make it hum, so to speak, but to like help you get there, because Eldrazi cost a lot of mana. And sure, there are a lot of ways to make 2 mana, 3 mana off your lands. They're giving us more in the Commander deck. There's that land that counts as like a Tron land and a Locust to power up your Cloud Post. So it's all that stuff. Like, cool. Then you have Forsaken Monument, which just gives you an additional mana on top of all of that, and on top of all your rocks that make it colorless. Like, Forsaken Monument just fits right in on the curve. And so I'm hoping we see it. But anything else before we cut out?
Nope.
All right. So for at MtG Cabalcast on Twitter, Facebook, Patreon, and YouTube, I am at Halt. I am Reptar. You are
at Damon_Thurston.
And we'll see you next week.